Hi again, everyone, and welcome back to Fridays at the Symphony. Well, as it happens, this morning I am recording this on Juneteenth, the 19th of June, which is, well, I'm sure sooner or later will become a national holiday. The day, of course, celebrating the liberation of African Americans in the United States. And honestly, as fate should have it, today was the day that I came to the point in the musical letter E where it was time to share with you and celebrate one of the great symphonic masterpieces of that American master of the jazz idiom, as important a figure in American serious music as Aaron Copland or George Gershwin or Leonard Bernstein. I'm referring, of course, to Edward Kennedy, or as he called himself, and as he will forever be known, Duke Ellington. Now, the Duke liked to write works in which the jazz and classical idioms kind of met halfway, met on a level playing field. As he got older, he dabbled in the practice of writing kind of jazz orchestral suites. He was fascinated with extending out the form of the typical jazz work, which can be rather short, but of course, depending on the improvisatory skills of the musicians involved, jazz works can go on for as long as Mahler symphonies. It all depends on the magic of the moment and the musicians involved. But generally, jazz forms are more compact than classical forms. And Duke Ellington always wanted to, again, bring about a kind of fusion of the jazz and classical idioms. He did that most famously in a series of suites he wrote in the 1950s and 60s, some of which are probably well known to some of you classical musical lovers out there. The suite after Edvard Grieg's own music for Ibsen's Peer Gynt is absolutely wonderful, and for reasons that have always eluded me, it has never been arranged for standard symphony orchestra with a jazz component. One of the other famous suites from the 1950s that has done with great success, international success really, is Duke Ellington's treatment of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. Now, in these compositions, these extended suites, his really equal collaborator as not only arranger but often composer was, a person almost as well known as the Duke is today. That's Mr. Billy Strayhorn, who was Duke Ellington's not just kind of arranger, but kind of all-around assistant and factotum. And it's fair to say that Duke and Billy would have been kind of lost without each other. They both performed essential support roles in each other's lives. And Strayhorn had a huge hand in the composition of those suites after Grieg and Tchaikovsky, and nowadays his work has finally been recognized. But in order to celebrate the genius of Duke Ellington, I'd like to go back to one of his, I would say, symphonic works in its musical scope, but written for jazz band, written for a large jazz orchestra, as would gather in the heyday of what we now refer to as the swing era in jazz, the 20s through the early 1940s, but especially the 1930s. Duke Ellington's fame at that point was at its zenith, and one of the works he composed from that era in 1937 on his own for his orchestra was one of my favorite works of American music, full stop. The Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue, or as Duke would always refer to it in his wonderfully formal way, the Diminuendo in Blue and the Crescendo in Blue. And it's good that he did, because it is, someone once asked me if you had to do on one evening the ultimate concert of American music, what would you do? And I said, well, I think it would take two intermissions like an opera, but I would do Charles Ives, Three Places in New England, like the ultimate kind of, turn of the 20th century kind of New England Yankee symphony, Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring, in many ways the successor to that work. In the middle, Leonard Bernstein's sprawling, magnificent symphonic dances from West Side Story. And then to finish, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, but then to really finish, Duke Ellington's Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue. It's that great a work. It's utterly original. It takes on, by using the terms diminuendo, which means fade, and crescendo, which means, getting louder. He consciously, I've been talking about how composers are always signaling to their audience in their key signatures and their titles, and here Duke is signaling to his audience as well for all time, because he's rather like when I was talking about, remember when Dvorak, the great Bohemian nationalist who rose up from humble origins to be one of the great composers of his time, remember when he wrote his Seventh Symphony? It's like he's writing a symphony by Brahms, as great as Brahms himself could have written it. I think with the Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue from 1937, Ellington is kind of tipping the hat to the George Gershwin of Rhapsody in Blue. But he's saying, Georgie boy, I think I can do what you did even better, with even more of a sense of synthesis. And I think that's actually true. Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue is a work that it would be no exaggeration to say became famous overnight. And that was almost 20 years later after its composition. It was the night of July the 7th, 1956, on a hot and muggy and thunderstorm-laden night at the legendary Newport Jazz Festival. Duke was playing the last set of the evening. He and his musicians were hot and tired and grumbling, and so was the audience, which was, as we know from the recording of the evening itself, was getting rather restive. Duke decided to pull off the music stand one of his favorite pieces from the good old days, his Diminuendo in Blue and Crescendo in Blue, as he said to the audience that night. Now you have to realize, by 1956, Duke Ellington and his whole style of American jazz are, to put it mildly, no longer the flavor of the month. Some point in the late 1940s, jazz had no longer been a form of music that you danced to. I mean, the 20s, 30s, and early 40s, they called it the swing era for a reason, because it was music you danced to. At some point in the late 40s, jazz transformed itself from that kind of music into being a high art, and really just another American form of classical music with its own repertoire and traditions. And so it was great for jazz to become kind of high culture, to finally kind of hit cruising altitude, as it fully and richly deserved by that point. And in that sense, the invention of the long-playing record at about that time made it possible for musicians like Duke Ellington and his many contemporaries to suddenly go into long form, to have more than 3.5 minutes on the side of a record to explore and develop their ideas. And of course, as we all know, they certainly did in the ensuing years. But again, jazz as a form of popular music by 1956 was just really kind of ebbing away. And not only was as dance music, again, it had kind of ceased to be that and gone into kind of a high art mode. But as a popular music, it of course by 1956 is, with each passing day, was being taken over, was being just pushed aside by something called rock and roll. Remember Elvis Presley? This is exactly the time of the arrival of those kind of artists. Similarly, those that great American tradition of those kind of hotel, swing orchestras, these big kind of big band 1930s, 1940s style jazz orchestras that would be, in the ballrooms of all the great hotels, like the Edgewater Hotel in Madison, or of course in Chicago, the Palmer House and the Drake, where you could drop by at around midnight and just dance the night away to some great hotel orchestra playing, music like Duke Ellington. By the late 50s, those days were almost completely gone. I think very sadly. It was kind of a heyday of American popular culture in that sense. And anyway, people are beginning to say, well, Duke Ellington, he was a great boy, he was great in the 30s, but he's getting washed up. And you could tell that tension was in the air as the audience was getting just downright restless by midnight on July the 7th, 1956. Well, Duke dusts off the shelf the Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue. And this is like the ultimate symphonic, long-form Duke Ellington piece, in that it really, without the slightest trace of self-consciousness, it really welds together the worlds of classical music and jazz music. Classical music, where you adhere to the printed page, and jazz, where the printed page is just the kind of the stopping off point, and from there you grow and grow in free improvisation. There is this long first section, the fade, the diminuendo, and then a long third section, the great build-up, the great crescendo. But in the middle, there's this solo, the wailing interval, as Ellington called it, which was written as an extended solo for his favorite tenor saxophone player, one of the great saxophone artists of the 20th century, the still to this day underrated Paul Gonsalves, not Gonzalez, but Gonsalves. He was of Cape Verdean descent, the Cape Verde Islands, those islands off West Africa that used to be a colony of Portugal and have produced some amazing musicians. Anyway, Mr. Paul Gonsalves took to the front of the stage to play the wailing interval solo in Diminuendo and Crescendo and Blue. He played. He's improvising, to this beat that you'll hear and you'll feel, and it's going really great. And he just decides to keep going. He keeps going and going and going, improvising again and again and again, a chorus on this chord progression that the Duke has written. He played for 27 choruses in this giant, 16-minute piece. By the middle of those 27 choruses, the audience, formerly kind of, again, growing restive, is just now, they just go crazy. And apparently it's come down to us that by this point, they're like these, again, this was the Newport Jazz Festival, these kind of Newport, Rhode Island, kind of waspy social register types have gotten up from their boxes and they're dancing. They're like jitterbugging, and the crowd goes nuts. And Duke Ellington, you can hear in the recording, he's like urging on Paul Gonsalves to play chorus after chorus. He's like, go, go, go. And he just keeps going and going. And finally, he stops. You can just imagine him mopping his brow. And then the full jazz orchestra comes back in with the crescendo in Blue. It just, by the end of this performance, everyone there, and within hours, everyone in the American jazz scene knew that Duke Ellington and his orchestra were back and better than ever. And it sparked a renaissance in Duke Ellington's career that lasted for another 15 years. So an amazing moment in American music, and not only as a performance, but the work in itself, this totally unself-conscious, just Ellington as the artist, nothing extra musical about this. Just Duke Ellington as the great artist, fusing the worlds of classical, the symphonic, and the jazz together in the Diminuendo in Blue and Crescendo in Blue, an American masterpiece here at its epoch-making performance live, the Newport Jazz Festival, around midnight on the 7th of July, 1956. One of the great moments in music history.